Hello and welcome to the NeoSystems Big Picture Cyber Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Don. Welcome, everyone, to our continuing series of Cybersecurity Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions. Our guest today is Chris Nissen. I also want to mention at the start that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our sketch note artist, Wade Forbes, you see on the screen, is going to be making a visual record of the conversation, and we'll go ahead and share that with everyone after we finish up today. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on federal government contractors. That's who we have mostly in our audience today. If you have some questions from the audience, please put those in the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work those into my conversation with Chris as much as I can. I'll start with an introduction of Chris Nissen. He's a repeat guest here on this series. Chris is the CEO and founder of IntelWerks and the Sahegan Group, companies that are dedicated to protecting the private sector from asymmetric nation-state threats through supply chain, cyber IT and OT, and insider exploitations and attacks. Chris is also a visiting professor of practice at ARLIS, a nonprofit university-affiliated research center at the University of Maryland, where he's working on cutting-edge challenges in supply chain security and developing tangible, holistic responses to the asymmetric threats that we face. Chris was recently Director of Asymmetric Threat Response and Supply Chain Security at the MITRE Corporation, where he worked since the mid-90s on big data analytics, some Intel projects I'm sure he can't talk to us about, and critical infrastructure protection issues. Chris, widely known as the lead author of the Deliver Uncompromised report from 2018, that really played a central role in shaping, current DoD supply chain policy, maybe broader than DoD, as well as the CMMC program as we know it. Chris, thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. It's great to be back.
So it's been a year since you joined us last. I was looking at my notes. It's been almost exactly a year. So first, welcome back. Probably too long between visits. At that time, we were in the midst of dealing with SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange exploitations, things that we sort of widely regarded as wake-up calls. Right. This week, the White House put out an unprecedented whole of nation alert stating that Russia is, quote unquote, exploring options for potential cyber attacks, quote from President Biden. How is our state of readiness? Are we ready to hit the gym here, or have we been sort of hitting the snooze button every 6 minutes since those wake up calls from a year ago?
It's mixed. That was quite an announcement, I think, or proclamation, I should say. It's interesting because after SolarWinds, myself and Rick Leggett and Charles Clancy and Chris Joswick, I can always butcher his name up, from MITRE, we wrote a paper on sort of the big picture lessons learned from SolarWinds, just basic, fundamental things like, we're driving fragility into our systems by commonality, and that's essentially what SolarWinds was. I don't see a whole lot of change there, and what concerned me about the announcement out of the White House and from CISA with their Shields Up program is, the private sector is a big space in the United States. So it's a little bit of yelling fire in a crowded theater. It's a really big theater. I think we need to be a little bit more targeted toward our messaging and actions and kind of get ahead of that curve as opposed to reactionary. But the bottom line is, no, I don't think, now I do think, CMMC with 1.0 and then 2.0, although it's, slowed down a little bit, we got through that first hurdle and, at least DoD came out with 2.0, and I've always described that as, absolutely necessary, but not sufficient in the long run. And we'll dive into that throughout this talk, I think. That call from the White House was more than just the DIB, right? The DIB is, probably 300,000 companies. There's quite a bit more than that in the overall private sector. So a bit of the snooze button for sure, but not across the board. I've, since I've left MITRE and I've been engaging more with the private sector, I really believe that there's some executive leadership, even for relatively small companies, 50, 100 people, that see the value of their enterprise being at great peril, and they realize if they lose that value, the government's not necessarily there to keep that from happening. So there's some real forward leaning thinking along those lines, and therefore, I used to say with my first briefings with Deliver Uncompromised that supply chain security back then was where cybersecurity was maybe 15 years ago, and that it would catch up quickly. I think we are making progress along those lines. And by that, I mean, you can't be running a company today and not at least go through due diligence, basic due diligence on cyber security. You can do a lot better than we are, but you got to at least pay attention to it. 4 years ago, there were people just absolutely ignoring their supply chain, and I'll define supply chain later in the talk, but I think that's changing, and COVID certainly accelerated that. I think the discussion around Deliver Uncompromised helped accelerate that. Some of the actions that the Congress has taken has accelerated that. So from that sense, I think we're making progress in terms of readiness, certainly awareness.
I'll say this, so, across our customer base, almost 100% of them are doing things now that they weren't doing before. I mean, they're improved their security posture and taking it more seriously, putting more effort into it. So in that sense, I think the wake up calls worked, at least on the people they worked on, right? Didn't work on everybody, but for the people who got the message, they're taking the right actions. Right. So the big news these days, and this is what prompted the Biden administration's announcement on Monday. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen only limited cyber activity, and the Ukrainians seem to have done a pretty good job of countering that. Is that what you expected? I mean, in terms of how those threats are intermingled with the more traditional threats in that current activity, current invasion?
I can't say I've expected it. However, in both of my companies, I work very closely with a very unique capability in the cyber realm that I call predictive. It's sort of over the horizon warning. And they recently took a look at Chinese and Russian cyber activity in CONUS. And they showed me the graphs, and there's just this precipitous drop starting in, say, mid-fall. And it's interesting. So there's a couple theories batting around. A, it flies in the face of what the White House is telling us. Now, maybe they're seeing prep. I don't know, but it does. It hits your statement that it's dropped, and there could be two reasons for that. The two prevailing theories are one, Russia's redirecting its capability against Ukraine and other actors that it may want to influence, and that's sort of a refocus. And China, in turn, is taking advantage of largely I want to say Western, but I guess it's more than Western. All these companies that are popping out of Russia, and some of them abandoning their assets. So there's a lot of cyber activity against their enterprises, either to cut a deal with Russia to purchase their assets or whatever. The other theory is that as things have escalated, that maybe a serious cyber attack against the United States, because we've said it before, would be considered an act of war, and hence maybe a radical escalation. I don't know which of those two are correct. They both make sense. We can kind of let that unfold, but I don't think anybody expected. As a matter of fact, I think the administration was warning in the fall prior to Ukraine. Everybody kind of knew it was coming, that, be prepared. And exactly the opposite happened. So they're both viable, and the answer could be it's a mix of both.
I mean, certainly Russia is capable of much more destructive activity than what we've seen so far in this current campaign. We've seen worse from them previously. And the Biden statement did make it sound like at least they believe there's more to come, and likely directed at us. If we do experience a significant cyber attack from Russia in the near term, which again, it sounds somewhat likely. What industries would you expect would be impacted the most? Where are the most likely targets here? Or not just targets, but impacts? It might not be the same.
Yeah, and it might not just be Russia. I do think that China folds into this mix in very complicated ways. I'm working on some integrated deterrent strategy at a national level, and it really requires you to think at this level, right? And because they're all asymmetric actions. I mean, clearly, you know, the grandfather critical infrastructures, you should always be leery of: the ability to move money, the ability to move energy, and the ability to move information. Those three things alone could bring the United States to its knees if done on a wide enough scale. I don't know, that seems kind of unlikely, because that would definitely be a major escalation. You can cause a lot more grief with instilling, I guess it's the tactic I like to use and advise my clients. You want to instill on your adversary doubt, confusion, and regret. Well, it wouldn't take much to instill confusion, and that could be done. I think it was a panel with you guys I ran in the fall or late summer, sort of the next generation of ransomware being not locking you out of your system, but making the data available but not trustable. So I think that's where cyber is ultimately going, to a very, very dark spot. And it may be annoying right now to get locked out of your system, but it may be even more annoying if you have access to your system, but you get a message that, hey, we've pseudo-randomly corrupted your, giant database. Good luck using that data. Totally different approach. So I don't know, they admit, who knows, I have said for years, and having spent, 33 years at MITRE and working in national security, that in many ways, I view I got to be careful how I say this, because I don't want anyone to take it the wrong way, but I do view the value of national intelligence against this problem set, that is something that's directed almost entirely at the private sector, as having peaked and decreasing. And the intelligence that we really need to counter this actually exists in the private sector, because they're attacking their system. And then that's why you see the government saying, please, please, please tell us what's going on, because they can't go into those systems. They're privately owned, they're privately run, and there's this lack of trust between the two parties. So that's okay. There's nothing wrong. I mean, there's companies like yours, Mandiant, although they just got bought by Google. There's this company I'm working with that can do predictive cyber. There's a fantastic company out there I work with that does software supply chain security. Let that innovation spin up and address that. I don't think, and I've always discouraged this image that there's a smoke-filled, dark room in the back of the Pentagon or the back of the CIA or something, that, oh, if we could only know what they know. I don't necessarily think that that's true. And for the protection of the private sector, I think a lot of your listeners are sitting on top of those systems that they own, and there's a lot to learn about what's going on, at your front door and within your system. Not just from a cyber perspective, but your entire supply chain, that you can really learn, garner some, what the government would call classified, but obviously isn't if you derive it that way. You combine that with publicly available information, and it's a pretty potent weapon.
Let's drill into that a little bit more. That question of visibility. Our supply chains are big. They're largely composed of small and mid-sized companies. In the defense sector, the statistic I've seen is 74% of the DIB is small and mid-sized companies. So these are companies that don't have, kind of by definition scale, they don't have, big, huge apparatus around threat intelligence and that kind of thing. But there's a lot going on in there. What is it going to take for us to get the visibility into the cyber risks that exist within those small and mid-sized companies and close those gaps? Like, I guess I'll start with the visibility question, because that's you kind of brought that up in the last answer.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, the size of the private sector that warning, that CISA and the president's warning went out, is, almost 11 million companies. And of that, 8 million of them are considered small companies. So, our current approach just doesn't scale, right? I mean, it's 11 million companies, and you're exactly right. And they're not all equal targets, right? So part of what I've been trying to do since Deliver on Compromise, and what I do as a consultant and solution provider, is I think we need to help. We need to do triage, right? The analogy I use against CISA's Shields Up, it's a Star Trek Enterprise analogy in my view, because that's where Shields Up came from. And it, I've actually used it as an analogy a few years ago, is that, and I'm not a Trekkie, so don't accuse me of that. So it may fall apart, but I don't think it does, is that, there's a trade-off. The more shield you have, then you can't go at light speed and you can't execute your mission. So you're just kind of stopped or moving very slowly, and you've got full protection. But if you want to fire, you got to take that down. And so what you want to do is figure out where is the threat coming from, and then direct the shield there. And then that gives you maneuverability. The notion that everybody should, put everything up is going to ultimately, it depends what you mean by it. Now, I'm not saying the basic things like CMMC and, just standard good hygiene. But I do think the answer in the long run is having I'll use a term that a small company would probably consider too fancy, but it's not how I mean it, is a sensor network. You really, and that's where the predictive stuff comes in, right? The more I can, it starts with how big of a target am I? What is my technology? Are they after it, or technology or service? And if I know that I'm pretty high on the target list, then what can I do to detect, right? So we can't defeat this by just constantly defending. In my view, and one of the things I put in that paper from MITRE on SolarWinds, it was beyond SolarWinds, is assume permeability. If you talk to some of the best Silicon Valley software engineers out there, and I won't mention the company, their view on security was, we just assume that they're inside. We assume that they're inside from an insider or from software, or they got in somehow. And what they do is they design their network so that it's not a catastrophic failure, that you can cordon them off. Few companies are really doing that. So having that sensor network, and that's one thing, assume that they're in the inside, because you can have 100%, locked up cyber presence, and someone can walk in with a thumb drive and because they were paid the money to do it, or something else, software or whatever, and still get in. So having a sensor network that looks across your enterprise, cyber for sure, but your people, your contractors, your software, and just detecting that something is amiss and giving you that early warning, I think would go a whole lot farther and scales. So yeah, I'm a little critical on saying everybody brace, but we're talking to, like I said, 11 million companies. So it's like, okay, that's a little hard to do. So the visibility, I think, that the government could help us with is there are ways to have a common operating picture of attacks in CONUS. And I've advocated it through some of my work with Harvey Rishikoff and at Arliss. We have the technology and we can do it in near real time. And that's non-cooperative. That's without going into the premise. I did a study a few years ago on, I just got some backbone internet traffic and just said, hey, let's do something really simple, nothing sophisticated, where, a bad actor may be moving through spots, compromised nodes in CONUS, which are hard to unwind. I just said, let's look at any traffic, either direction, going into Fortune 500 companies that's going directly to Tehran, Iran, sanctioned country. There really shouldn't be anything. Now, you might run into one or two that are maybe, on a government contract and they've got a walled system and they're trying to, probe their internet or something. Okay. What I saw was shocking. And I mean, hundreds of megabytes flowing, every 250 milliseconds from 6 or 7 countries to Tehran. Okay, that's not good. Someone's not even looking, right? So what I'm talking about, well, if you have a sensor network, you at least see that, it's at your front door. I'm looking at it from the other side of the country, and well, that's pretty serious stuff right there. So I think that detection and pushing any technology or approach that can push that detection earlier and earlier and earlier is absolutely invaluable. And I can give you a couple examples. In the last 3 or 4 weeks, 3 companies have been hit by lapses, right? NVIDIA, 3rd week of February. And I think last week, Ubisoft and Okta. It's believed lapses hit, excuse me?
Okta, yeah.
Okta. It's believed lapses hit all of them. That's believed to be a South American entity. They're, I think, strictly ransomware. But this predictive company I work with has seen exfil on all 3 of those companies going back to last fall at a low level. So the warning signs were there. Actually, they go way before last fall, but then last fall they pick up. And then they pick up and they stay up until end of February, beginning of March. Well, all the warnings were there. But that underscores what Mandiant said in one of their security reports, I think like 3 or 4 months ago, that 53% of attack infiltrations go unnoticed, 68% of ransomware attacks go unnoticed, and 91% of attacks never sound an alarm. And now you can see why. I mean, I've seen Fortune 500 companies with hundreds of megabytes going to Iran. 3 companies, they've had exfil and they don't see it. That's the problem. Shield, and I'll bet you, I don't know, I have any idea. I haven't done any work for NVIDIA or Ubisoft or, any of them. I'll bet you, at least NVIDIA is saying they would have probably said, we got a pretty robust cyber defense system. There's no way. They're a microelectronics company in a very high-tech field, but it apparently went unnoticed. So that to me is more the root problem.
That's interesting. And jumping way back, I like that you used the Star Trek analogy. When I first heard shields up, I thought about sort of medieval guys on a battlefield. When they're thinking the archers are going to rain down a bunch of arrows on their heads, they put their shields up, right? And then, but they don't move. They can't fight in that position. They're hunkered down. And so I think that analogy works too, as well as the Star Trek analogy that you got to take the shields down to fight well. So let me dive into that visibility and think about that in the sense of information sharing. So a lot of the cybersecurity effort that we do today is focused on prevention, right? More than the detection you mentioned, making sure our systems are hardened, making sure it's difficult for attackers to find weaknesses. But as you pointed out, adversary is going to find a way around even those robust defenses. So detection, response, very important. A key to that is the reporting and information sharing. So you mentioned information that may exist, but is not currently being shared on the operational side. What we've seen from CISA and FBI, it's very active promotion of voluntary information sharing, but it's mostly around after an incident. Only the sort of recent announcements they've been putting out saying, hey, tell us about unsuccessful attacks too. Tell us about things that are not a breach, things that are not maybe mandatory reporting, but still valuable. I guess you talked about it from a technical side about that common operating picture. Before that, we got to address the issue of motivation. So how do we encourage and incentivize private sector to even participate in that kind of operational information sharing? I mean, today, they'll report on a mandatory basis if they need to, but man, it's not, I got an email this morning from someone who's had an incident and we don't want to report it unless we absolutely have to. If it's ironclad 100%, we got to do it. If it's 99%, we're not doing it, right? So what how do we shift that around where people view that kind of reporting and information sharing as a plus, not a minus to their companies?
Actually, I can dive into. I'll keep it generalized. I can dive into the architecture proposal that Harvey and I and a few others put together. I think the answer is you have a trusted third party or two in between those entities. So our thought was, look, there's 4 or 5 really good private sector cybersecurity firms out there, right? Mandiant, FireEye, Microsoft. There's a list of them, and a lot of companies have them are clients of theirs, right? So here we could go into the DIB, right? But you don't have to. It can go beyond the DIB. But let's just talk about that. So we've got the DIB. We've got 100 to 300,000 companies in the DIB. And we could say, hey, if you're not a client of one of these big 5 cybersecurity vendors, you need to be. And we could create that marketplace. Hey, if we make this mandatory, you guys are going to get a much bigger market share, so the price can come down. And that's going to give you, and they work for you. So, I own a company, and now I've got Mandiant watching over my cybersecurity, and they have that data. And now we've got the government all over here that ultimately wants it. So we put a third party between them. It could be, a nonprofit. It should be a nonprofit, I believe. It could be, the NDISAC. It could be an FFRDC. It could be a national lab. It could be a UR. It doesn't matter. It's someone who's not in it to make a nickel. And then Mandiant and the other companies could share the events, but in a anonymized, obfuscated fashion. So we did this in counterterrorism, right? Because we've got privacy laws, and they say a U.S. corporation is a private citizen and a citizen. So when you see that reporting, we could still connect the dots, but it was U.S. person 1, U.S. company 1, and that was all in the public when you had to unmask that at a certain level with the right authority. Well, who is this? Right. So that data can be shared and still connect the dots. And the company can feel a lot better because their stuff is, they've got a legal obligation, the cybersecurity company, to protect it. It's obfuscated, maybe even mapped and randomized. But yet over here with this third party company and now entity, and now you can start to connect the dots and get to that near real time. Why is that important? One, it scales. If it would be CISA's worst nightmare if all 10.7 million companies said, okay, we're going to start sending emails to CISA. We're going to report everything. They couldn't handle it. It's like nonsensical, right?
No,
and
we're going to
you
get beyond email and after the fact reporting, right?
Right. And I read some of the draft legislation, and it was like open text. It's like, you guys are never going to do anything with this. I get the spirit, but you're never going to do anything with it. So it's got to be automated. It's got to be anonymized. It's got to be protected. And now you can start to get really valuable information. For instance, back to that targeting, you can see, okay, well, wow, it's really interesting. They're looking at specific satellite downlink nodes, or they're looking at natural gas stations, and you can start to see the threat picture across geography, across time and space. And that's far more valuable than getting a snippet from maybe Colonial Pipeline said, hey, they looked at me, and all they were doing was, okay, well, they're too hard. We're not going to do anything with them. That's the thing that I've learned with this predictive stuff is, there's recon, there's attack, and there's breach. So recon and attack, and the analogy I draw is it's your house, and recon is they're driving by slow and looking at the house. Attack is they figured out, okay, there's no lights in back, so I'm going to go around back and I'm going to try picking the lock. And breach is they're carrying the HD TV out the door, right? Well, there's a lot of false signal in recon and attack, depending on what's going on. So a lot of these reports that the government's asking for, are actually going to be not worth much, because it may just be recon. They're knocking on the door. Ooh, I can't get in, or I can't pick the lock. I think you need to start thinking about it from a holistic standpoint. Use the market, use the marketplace, and it leaves lots of room for, I'd love to see, either Neo be 1,000 times bigger or 1,000 more Neos or something in between, to help those companies. They get that intel from the big five, intel specific to them, and now it's like, how do I protect myself better? Because that tends to be some of the early detection. And you'll see, when I look at this data and I'm like, well, wow, there was no recon. And SolarWinds, for example, right? There's a little bit of attack and then breach. And as soon as I looked at it, I'm like, that's a software or an insider. They got in through another mechanism, more than likely, right? So it does take the big picture view, I think, to come to solutions that scale and meet all parties. And it's hard to make an argument against it, because the only ones that would actually be against it are rice bowls within the government that say, we got that. Well, no, they don't, because the reality is any of the monitoring that the government's doing comes outside of FBI under a warrant or with cooperation, comes right up against, 98% of the traffic flowing out there is TLS encrypted. So it's like, okay, you see what port they came in, you have no idea what's in the packets, it's back out. Whereas if you've got the cooperation of the enterprise, like these companies have, they're right in there and they know, okay, this was at this desk, this was this MAC address. Anyways.
And to use your home break-in analogy, a lot of detection today is post-breach. You see your HDTV listed for sale on eBay and you're like, dang, is that thing missing? Holy cow.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm trying to turn that paradigm around. Right. It's where I'm trying to work.
We're at the end of our time. Let me ask a quick closing question for you, just to give some action-oriented advice to our audience. For what's coming and the warnings we're getting from the White House and others right now says, what should senior executives and board members be thinking about in terms of actions to take today?
Well, always welcome to talk to them at any time, but I really think you need to sit back and see where you fit in this attack ecosystem. In other words, you really kind of have to pay attention to what's going on the world stage, right? Ransomware is one thing. You got to be worried about that. I would say, understand, what do you look like to your adversaries? It may be a nice juicy target that they'd really like to get in for something going on the world stage. How much of a target do you think you are? And I wouldn't put it all on Russia. I mean, China is very active in the cyberspace and they're colluding to some degree. And, we've seen in the open press, before an acquisition is made or before they might make a move to move your company, China may be coming after you, and they do it. So it's, what do you look like? How do you want to look? You can manage that. And then how can I move myself into this proactive space of detection? So assume permeability and turn the tables on them. And then, if you're really, and it's more than just cyber, right? So look at the whole supply chain. That is your people, that is your employees, that is your contractors, that is your software. Because if you have a rock solid cyber system, which we want to get everybody to, they will come around another way. And if you're high enough technology and you're on the Made in China 2025 list, they won't start with cyber. They'll try to come in through a business venture, or they'll try to get an employee into your company. So it takes kind of this big thinking, and kind of a strategic vision, and then triage of your risks. So hope that makes sense. Happy to talk to anybody afterwards, though.
That's good advice, Chris. Thank you. And we did put your contact information in the chat window. The video seems to be frozen up. I hope everybody is able to hear us okay. I heard you well, Chris, even though your video froze. But yeah, contact information for Chris is in the chat window if anybody wants to get a hold of him. Thank you, Chris, for joining us. Thank you, Wade, for capturing this in a artwork format. And thanks to the audience for your time and attention today. Please join us for future cybersecurity town hall meetings. Our next session will be next Wednesday, March 30th at 1 o'clock Eastern. Oh, someone is saying the chat window is disabled. I will read off the information since if that's not working. Chris Nissen is at CAN@Souhegan Group, SOUHEGAN Group.com, and his phone number is 781-254-7642. So I'll read that again, 781-254-7642. Anyway, we have additional session coming up next week, March 30th at 1 o'clock Eastern. If you don't have the invitation for that and the details in your inbox, please go to our website, neosystemscorp.com. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks.